Well, so if this is going to be kind of a situation where Israel, as you say, kind of sees who its real friends are and who's, you know, trying to play both sides or outright hostile, how do you think it will view the U.S.? Because, on the one hand, there's been a lot of support in the U.S. for Israel. I think by polls, most people do support Israel. But then you also have, BLM supporting the specific Hamas paratroopers who who did the attack. So how do you think they're going to be viewing the U.S.?
Well, I actually think that this is something where the U.S. media and the Israeli media diverge quite a bit in how it's presented. I think that positive feelings for the U.S. and the U.S. administration in general are extremely high. Like the views of Israel is one of the few places in the world that had in which former President Trump had a more than 50% approval. I think it was Israel, India, and one or two other places. But Biden is now the most popular U.S. president in Israeli history. And even among people who I know and have seen talk and who I know personally, who are quite conservative, who would never vote for Joe Biden in a million years, they have praised him publicly and his position on the war in ways that I would never have imagined. In Israel, there are Hebrew billboards of Biden, thanking Biden for his support, thanking the administration. And what we see here in terms of the protests, in terms of the position, not just of the far left, like Rashida Tlaib or Ilhan Omar or AOC, but also from like Louis Gohmert and the sort of far right, or Rand Paul and the sort of isolationist wing. Like, there's awareness of that. But I think that there is also enough of an understanding, actually more of an understanding than many Americans have, that despite the coverage in the media, like the Israelis are pretty well aware that the polling in the US still has tremendous support for Israel in a way that I think many Americans don't realize, because it's the people who are loud who you see and who make headlines. And it's the young, loud people that are sort of the anti-Israel people. And, the sad, in this case, it might work out for a position I favor, but the sad reality in the US is like young people don't vote. I mean, they vote at significantly lower rates. And, and so I think there's more awareness there that there's not any sort of sea change here than there is here, if that makes sense.
Well, so this could be a situation where the U.S. really can take advantage of, maybe taking advantage is the right word, but, if Israel sees that China has been, let's say, at best, wishy-washy, and the U.S. gives them support, the U.S. might be able to put a little more pressure on Israel to, stop them from selling chips and this technology to China.
I very much hope so. I mean, as you said, I try to highlight this wherever I can. When I was last on the show on October 6th, I tried to highlight it. And then, of course, the next day I'm thinking, now there will be this video out with me really going after Israel out on October 7th, which the timing obviously couldn't be helped. But I stand by the position I took. I mean, I think the U.S. has a lot of leverage over Israel because of the support we provide. I am supportive of that support, but I'm supportive of it in part because of the leverage. And we're not using that leverage in a way. So I think that we should have done more before. I think we can do even more now. And when I say now, I mean right now. It's not going to go over too well if we just say if tomorrow there was a statement about it. But in a few months, as the war does start to wind down, or does wind down, this is absolutely something that the United States should do. I would hope, well, I've been wrong before, but I would hope that it would be met much more receptively in the Knesset than it would have been prior to October 7th, because of I think what I think is China's mistake, both moral and strategic, in in supporting Hamas.
Well, leverage to do what specifically? Are you talking about just with China, or what do you mean by leverage?
Oh, well, in this context, talking about vis-a-vis China, right? That I think that Israel should be much less willing. Israel does not have to allow Chinese firms to invest in high-tech industries that produce dual-use technology. There's not some sort of requirement that they do that. And unlike here, the Israeli government, even in private sector firms, the Israeli government tends to own a stake, right? If the Israeli Defense Ministry invests in a company, they actually take an ownership stake, which U.S. law prohibits here. Use that to your advantage. Like, here, the government's part of an owner of the company. They don't even have to pass any sort of new legislation about it. Just in the internal board of directors type level, veto it. Don't, why is it happening? And when it comes to, I get that there could be contractual issues, but China should play no role in major investment in infrastructure programs in Israel itself, which it does, and a little bit trickier from the Israeli side, but it really shouldn't be allowed to do so in Gaza either. I mean, and if we see from the Syrian experience, I would assume that one of China's sort of end games here is that they would like to be the ones not to govern Gaza, because no one on earth really wants to do that, but someone's going to have to rebuild it. Right, and there are states in the region that will have the money to fund it, but are not going to have the capacity to rebuild. And China, will have that capacity if there is a way, a legal way for Israel to do what it can in that regard to push back on it. I think it should. That might be a tougher one, but there are things that it can do. One thing Israel does is when the U.S. There's some technical things, there's a blacklisting, but when the U.S. says, okay, firm X, like, we don't want you to sell this technology that allows you to listen into someone's phone without even them opening, whatever. We don't want you to sell it to any U.S. adversaries or such a short list. What that company often does is just reincorporate as a new company or a spinoff and do it anyway. This is something where we should pressure Israeli politicians to get a law passed through the Knesset to prevent that from happening. And again, I think maybe there will be more appetite for that now. And I mean more appetite for that there, right? Where the argument about hedging, the argument about just the need to make money, all those arguments, I think will be less salient than but look, we found these weapons there, and what did they do? Or what was their position on the war?
Of course, I guess this all assumes who's ever in charge of the U.S. a year from now wants to make use of that leverage.
Yes, this is a very good point. that I try to block out of my mind.
I'm not looking forward to this year.
It kind of just suddenly hit me that it's actually like only a year away that there's going to be potentially a new president.
Yeah.
And there's voting in 2 weeks. I mean,
it's a Super Tuesday.
It's that is a good point. It is definitely a concern. I think, though, that depending on who the next Israeli prime minister is, it might be less of a concern. Like, it's a genuine might. It really depends. It could be that someone comes in who that is already their view, because it's not like the Israeli society is it's so divided in every way except some sort of love of China. Like, that's ludicrous. So it could be that whoever comes in already is somewhat hawkish about this, and there will be a political will to get something done. That is a possibility. But it's also possible but the opposite is also possible. So we'll see. But I think it's going to be probably more driven by the Israeli public anyway than by the U.S. But your point is very, very, very well taken and horrifying.
Is there, like, in Israel, like in the US, it kind of is like, okay, you see maybe conservatives being more concerned about China and the CCP. I mean, I think it's a bit more broad because there's something like 70% of Americans don't trust China, according to like Pew polls. But I think the perception is that of the two political parties, more Republicans have been harder on China. Is there like any kind of breakdown like that in Israel?
Not really. It's sort of too hard to break it down by party, in part because the nature of the Israeli political system is that in each election there can be completely different parties. And there's some that are kind of always there, although the rise and decline of support is extremely dramatic. But unlike here, if you started a new party tomorrow, you'd be lucky to get a city council seat, like, I don't know, in like Waterbury, Connecticut, just making that up as a place. In Israel, you could start a new party tomorrow and get 15 seats in the Knesset and sort of be the kingmaker. And so it's very hard to do polling by party very far in advance. And, you can also have a situation like we have now, where Netanyahu, his support is at a historic low. But even when he keeps winning these elections, he wins with like 28-30% support. And so it's just very hard to say. And I would also, and hard in the moment, and probably the moment is going to be this whole year, because it's not something that anyone probably is spending a lot of time thinking about. In the same way that if we were at war with Mexico and Canada was at the same time firing missiles across the border, we might not think about it too much either. We would think about it if China was arming Canada, but the average person, as they go about their life, is going to be much more worried about the actual missile that's coming to hit them than about the broader geopolitics. So
yeah, I mean, we talked about that a bit before the attack, even I think the last time you were on, that like China is not necessarily top of mind for
exactly,
yeah.
But I will say but we have seen polling in December. I forget the date, and I think around December 19th ish. There have been some polls released from the region, and the sad reality is that support for Hamas is not high, but it is higher than it was, as is support for China, as is support for Russia. It's not, again, in some cases it's above 50%, but in many cases not. But relative to what it was on October 6th, support for China in the region in general, outside of Israel, has had a slight to moderate increase in support, ranging, depending on the state, from about 1 or 2% within the margin of error to about 10 to 12%. And that is thought to be tied to the perception that China is truly a neutral arbiter, and the U.S. is just, it will just back whatever Israel does.